I'm Mike, and you're watching Mininomicon. Welcome to the first episode of Mininomicon. A little bit about myself. I've been doing art for a very, very long time. Starting off traditionally in 2D, moving up to 3D modeling. I actually have a background in video games, and I've just been all around and versatile with my artwork. One thing that I've always enjoyed, even though I don't get enough time to do such, is actually paint miniatures. A bit of a taboo subject in the house as growing up. Unfortunately, it's the devil's work. I only got to paint certain things, not in the realm of D&D, Call of Cthulhu, things like that. But it was mostly in like mini car models, things of that such. I actually have been able to dive deeper into what I truly love and enjoy, and that's painting miniatures in an eldritch theme. I love monsters. I can't get enough of them. It's just something I've always been drawn to, and many of you feel the same way. So we connect on that level. I wanted to tackle something that nobody else does. Eldritch horror. I just enjoy it, and I'm sure you do as well. So on that note, let's go ahead and introduce to you on the first episode a couple of tiny miniatures that I got a while ago. I just haven't really figured out what I want to do with them. These are from Saber Miniatures. They're actually little dice. They're little six-sided dice with Cthulhu coming out of them. You've probably seen them on eBay or floating around online. I thought they were pretty fascinating, especially since I love dice. I'm sure you love dice. And if you love Eldritch horror or anything Cthulhu, like I do, I'm kind of holding off basing for these until I find out how many more there are, or if it's within the same theme or anything like that. So I'm going to run you down through the basics for some of these small little miniatures, and we'll get right to it. First thing you're going to want to do is take your miniature over to the sink, attempt to drown him in it, like a crime boss, and wash his mouth out with soap because he's got a mouth like a sailor and he tried to kiss your mother with it. And after you've talked out your differences, go ahead and dry him off because you kind of felt bad for doing so, but at least now he knows who's in charge. But you decided to double cross him and take a knife to him, start cutting off all the little tender bits. Start removing all the flash and all the miscellaneous pieces that don't really need to be a part of the model. Be sure to also take the blade across the seams to kind of remove all those mold lines. That way you get a nice, clean model. If your model does come in several pieces, be sure to test fit it and make sure it's going in the right spot. Nothing more of a pain in the ass than getting halfway through a project and realizing you have something on backwards. Just remember, if it looks wrong, it is. Sanding tools can actually be quite paramount with your miniatures. Getting rid of those pesky mold lines, any extra flashing that you might have missed, and they'll come in multiple sizes and variations. Just be careful that you're using the right one because you really don't want to gouge in new details that aren't necessary. Since the miniature is so small, I just hand painted on some Vallejo black primer instead of having to rattle can or clean an airbrush later. And here I unknowingly applied an entire lake of super glue so I can put this wing on this miniature. Some cleanup will come later, but for the most part, I just hold it in place for a few seconds so it will cure, and I put it off to the side so I can continue with the other model. I decided to go with Goblin Green from Vallejo paint. This will provide me with a solid base mid-tone. This way it'll give me a good idea where all my shapes are in the head as well as the tentacles. That way I have a good idea where I'm going to put my highlights and my shadows. I know what you're gonna say. Hey, why aren't you using a base for your model? Unfortunately, I don't have anything to really tack them right now, so I'm going old school and I'm manhandling them with my big old swamp donkey fingers. Using the source light from above, I can actually pick out and see where my highlights would actually fall on my miniature. I then decided to choose Vallejo's Pale Flesh. This way it will give me a nice creamy highlight for my miniature. I then proceed to add several layers and kind of blending it into the base coat just to kind of get a nice transition between the different colors. I then kind of work around the entire miniature, putting the highlights where I saw them, kind of going back and forth between the light and adding paint. And then I went back with more goblin green just to kind of transition between the different highlights as well as the actual midtones of the paint. For the recesses of the eyes, I went with jade green from Vallejo paint. I didn't want to go too dark because later on I'm going to be giving his eyes a neon glow. I used Arctic white for the eyes, so that way when I make them glow green, they will be much brighter. Using dark green from Vallejo paints, I then proceeded to add the shadows into the crevices of the miniature to basically create a higher contrast between the different layers and just kind of blended it in to make a nice smooth transition. Bringing back some of the highlights in the head would help maintain that contrast. And then I wanted to make the miniature a little bit more realistic, like actual squid skin. So I wanted to add in some spots and freckles to really bring that out. Then I used livery green from Vallejo paints for the glow effect, watering it down so the pigments would spread to create that soft transition. Then I softly glazed it over the highlight on top just to make it a little bit more lifelike. So I decided for the model that I really wanted to go with a traditional green for Cthulhu, but then of course at the same time for the die I wasn't quite sure what I really wanted to do for the theme, so well, why not make the dice out of stone? But then the real question is, what was I going to do with the pips, the little indentations in the die? I was all like, well, his eyes glow green, so why not make the pips glow green? To make the die look more like stone, I'm using Somber Gray and Wolf Gray from Vallejo paint. I'm using the Somber Gray to just kind of get that nice mid-tone. Since the die is already set in black, it's going to give me my shadows regardless, and then I'm using the Wolf Gray to bring out some really nice highlights. For the pips, I'm basically recreating the same process that I used for the eyes. Putting in the touch of jade, putting in a little dot of the Arctic white, and then topping it off with the livery green. This is where things get a little tricky. I'm highlighting the die as you would normally light a cube, but I'm also having to paint an actual texture on a flat surface that actually doesn't have a texture. So I'm creating things, but then also having to highlight those faces as if the textures were there. It's kind of hard to explain. It's a lot like normals in video games and how they refract light. It's a lot of trial and error. Here I'm just making varying details of roughed up edging as if the die had been thrown around for centuries, basically. Since it is made out of stone, it's gonna have little nicks and chips and things like that, because it's old. Here is a prime example of the trial and error method. I got it to a good position, then I didn't like it, then I messed it up, and then I had to go back
and it's a lot of back and forth just getting it to where you really want it, but yet still being correct with lighting. Now that the miniature is pretty much all entirely painted, I can finally distinguish and clean up different highlights and shadows to really kind of balance out the contrast, brightness, and everything for the actual miniature, just to kind of call it good. I didn't want the video to run like super long as I painted the second model. I pretty much redid all the same steps that I did for the first one. Well, thanks for coming by and checking out the channel. This is just kind of like a preview of some of the episodes to come. I will break down the steps that I do in a much smaller scale so I can explain it a little bit more in advance. Between blending shadows, highlights, stuff like that. If you want to support the channel, I do have a website, which is strangeaeongames.com, somewhere on the screen. I will put a link down below in the description. Same with an affiliate link. It'll have affiliate links to all the stuff that I do use. So if you wanted to support the channel, go ahead and click those links at no additional cost to you, and I do get a kickback from that, so I can continue doing content creation for the community as well. I do have a shirt on the store as well with the Mininomicon logo. But don't forget to like, subscribe, share with your friends. I'm trying to do one a week until Craig comes back to start doing more for Two Wizards, One Table. Once again, I appreciate you guys hanging out with me, and you guys stay safe out there. Take it easy.